I wonder if Somerton is aware of the similarity. It would be weird if he wasn't, because it was one of his favourite books of 2021. He started the Indiegogo with
James Somerton's favorite book of 2021 was Final Girl Support Group?
You'll be shocked.
I'm pretty sure I know that book. Yeah, my friend wrote about how this book is awful for his blog and sent me a draft of the article for feedback. I don't think he ever published it, though. I'm probably the only one who's ever read this. Okay, for real though, his article was a pretty academic analysis by someone who's seen all the movies being referenced and reads books with titles like Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film, and to summarize his opinion, Final Girl Support Group is bad and dumb. On the other hand, my qualifications are that I can read. I normally read and watch fantasy and sci-fi, so I'm the perfect guy to explain how this book comes off to someone without any significant background knowledge of the genre. Like, I know who Jason Voorhees is, but if Grady Hendrix tells me that there was actually no Final Girl in the Friday the 13th series until it was on its 4th movie or something, I just have to take his word for it. I have no idea. It definitely wouldn't speak well of the book that the more familiar you are with the academic conversation it's participating in, the worse the reading experience is. But if it's a good book for anyone who has no idea what they're talking about, that would explain why James Somerton liked it. So I read the Final Girl Support Group. You know those video essays that are 90% plot summaries of the media they're analyzing, interspersed with quips that seem less like they're adding up to some kind of critical analysis and more like the writer is just trying to keep themselves entertained through the dull task of writing a Wikipedia summary? I don't want this to be one of those, so let's keep the summary short. I'm going to skip every part of the book that doesn't end up mattering, which is most of it. The Final Girl Support Group is aggressively set in 2010 for some reason and features a therapy group for the girl who killed Jason, the girl who killed Ghostface, the girl who killed Freddy, he gets better, the girl who killed Michael Myers, the girl who killed Leatherface, and the protagonist who didn't kill anyone. She played dead until a cop came and saved her. I thought her backstory was original to the book, but that friend who wrote the Men, Women, and Chainsaws article edited the script for me, and he says that this one is based on some obscure thing called Silent Night, Deadly Night? Yeah, I never heard of it either. Apparently its sequel is the source of a meme?
Garbage Day! Huh? No!
Real talk, guys, I never even heard of the meme. Editing chamomile from the future of the past, you can probably guess that these pictures of the characters come from the movies they're based on, not the book. So these are the actual Final Girls from the 70s and 80s. And 3 out of 5 of them are blonde. Tropes are bullshit. Also, the character the protagonist is based on is Denise, who is a minor character in Silent Night, Deadly Night. She has a gratuitous sex scene and then she gets killed, which means she's topless for like 90% of her screen time. I've pulled the video from Dead Meat's kill count video on Silent Night, Deadly Night because he's already gone to the trouble of making this footage YouTube friendly, and I'm crediting him here on principle, even though, like, he's Dead Meat. He has 6.5 million subscribers. Either you already know about him or you don't care. Anyway, it's been 30 years, so the girl who killed Jason is now the woman who killed Jason, except actually she's dead. She died off page. That's the inciting incident. The gang immediately decides to split up. I swear I'm not glossing over anything. They are in a group therapy session when they get the news, and they immediately scatter for no given reason. The woman who killed Ghostface shows up at the protagonist's apartment later on, and they get attacked by a sniper. The protagonist flees alone, and then chapters 4 through 19 are a series of side quests and plot cul-de-sacs that go nowhere and accomplish almost nothing. The almost is because 2 new characters do get introduced. The first is Skye, the adult son of the therapist who leads the support group, and the other is Stephanie, the first new Final Girl in ages, who joins the protagonist for one of the last side quests. If the guy Stephanie killed is from an actual slasher flick, it's not one I recognize, but there's some connection to off-brand Jason, so maybe it's one of the Friday the 13th movies? Anyway, Stephanie and Skye turn out to be evil for no given reason, and they are the main villains. There is one more thing accomplished in the side quest when the protagonist and Stephanie are teamed up. The protagonist doesn't know Stephanie is evil yet. They find someone named Chrissy, a Final Girl whose franchise I do not recognize. And Chrissy's deal is that she fell in love with slashers. The protagonist kills Chrissy and then resolves not to kill anyone else. Luckily for her, the United States has a well-developed carceral state, ready and eager to take Stephanie and Skye into custody after they're incapacitated by the teleporting superpowers that the woman who killed Freddy had all along, but chose not to use until that moment. I swear I'm not making that up. It comes from left field in the book just as much as in this summary. So my first conclusion from this cold read of the Final Girl Support Group is that this book is about something, probably. Final Girl Support Group really badly wants to have a theme. Unfortunately, it has no idea what that theme should actually be. Every 4 chapters or so, it loses interest in the current theme and moves on to a new one, with character arcs and plot beats lurching drunkenly to catch up with the thematic infrastructure while it chases squirrels. A book can try to be about multiple things, but this one isn't. It's about one thing after another, and pretends it was about its latest theme all along. It's not a complex, multi-layered narrative. It was written by a chipmunk with an Adderall addiction. So here's my internet-friendly list of the top 8 things Final Girl Support Group briefly pretends to be about, before getting bored and doing something else instead. Number 3 will blow your mind. In the immediate aftermath of learning that the woman who killed Jason has herself been killed, the Final Girl Support Group immediately splits up, and far from noticing that this is stupid in the first place because there is strength in numbers, and stupid again because "let's split up, gang" is a stereotypical way to die in a slasher movie, the narrative acts like this is some act of hardened survivalist instinct on behalf of our heroes. I know I brought this up already, but Jesus Christ, this book has its protagonists do the most stereotypically stupid thing, and it tries to make them look like such badasses when they're doing it. Whatever. Once she's on her own, the protagonist does this thing where she keeps stopping so anyone following her will have to walk past, and checks to see if there's any repeated shoes going by. It's easy to change your jacket or t-shirt, but changing shoes requires more effort. That's pretty clever, and totally unnecessary when the guy who's after you is fucking Leatherface. This guy isn't exactly blending into a crowd. This early section of the book also talks about how, quote, "men don't have to pay attention the way we do. Men die because they make mistakes. Women, we die because we're female," close quote. Don't be fooled by the we. The protagonist might be a woman, but the author is a man. Anyway, this is false. Homicide by stranger has always been massively higher for men than for women. But violent crime is so low across the board that we still don't really have to care. When women get killed, it's almost always by an intimate partner or a family member. If this is supposed to be a commentary on slasher victims, then still no. I haven't seen these movies, but I know it's full of horny heterosexual teenagers getting murdered, in which the most likely final survival is a virgin girl. And from that, I can puzzle out that there are boys present and they don't have great survival rates. None of this makes the slightest bit of sense as a commentary on slasher movies or on women as victims of homicide. It's clearly going for a parallel to women as victims of sexual assault, which is already shaky ground to be on because most sexual assaults are committed by someone the victim knows, not an escapee from the nearby mental hospital or a swamp mutant reanimated by a lightning strike. But also, the book just kind of completely drops this theme about a quarter of the way in and never comes back to it. At the beginning of the book, the protagonist is attacked in her apartment, not by a slasher with a meat hook or a machete, but by a sniper. Sniper is probably too much credit. He takes a couple of shots and still can't actually hit his target, but he attacked at long range with a regular military-grade firearm is the point. The book doesn't really make anything of this immediately, like it's kind of hard to do creative kills with a gun, but it's not like slashers aren't allowed to use them, so it doesn't stick out as some obvious paradigm shift. Towards the end of the book, though, there's a whole thing about mass shooting. Emails between the two villains talk about getting adult body counts, and this is coming from a teenager, so maybe it's supposed to sound stupid and ridiculous that there is a number of murders that is more adult than the alternative. Like, do 12-year-olds go around racking up single-digit kill counts, and so the 16-year-old speaker is trying to distance herself from that by swinging for 20+? But to be unnecessarily generous to a stupid book, this is the kind of dumb thing a 16-year-old would say, and the character saying it is 16. For most of the final chapters, the book decides it was about mass shootings all along, framing mass shooters as, like, upgraded level 2 slashers. The final villain is a dude with guns and tactical gear, something which the protagonist is weirdly dismissive of, like, oh, this is the kind of thing a juvenile little boy would think looks cool. And like, the kind of kid who shows up to high school in tactical gear is definitely trying to throw how gritty and battle-ready he is straight into the face of every single person who looks at him. But the villain in this case is actually shooting people. He is using tactical gear for its intended purpose of making it quick and easy to access spare magazines for an assault rifle. It was designed for that, and it's better at that job than anything else. Like, the idea behind the pouches and such is that you'll be murdering people who are shooting back at you, but the vest just helps you get bullets in the gun quicker and easier. It doesn't care what you do with them after that. But okay, whatever. The villain is a mass shooter, and the book's point with that is that, randomly murdering innocent people is bad? I guess I'm glad we're on the same page. The book has this bit where one of the side characters uses her dream magic that she had the whole time and did never mention until now to stop the villain, but the book tries to play this as having done it non-violently, and no, you did it non-lethally, but not non-violently. You tackled the guy, and then kicked him in the balls repeatedly, because this book has a low-key fixation on sexual violence against men. So the book doesn't actually feature talking down a shooter at all, just distracting him so that violence can save the day, and then immediately afterwards it celebrates that violence. Batman has a no-killing rule too, and I doubt this book would be eager to hold him up as an icon of non-violent conflict resolution, considering how eager it is to belittle anything that appeals primarily to a male demographic. And like, is that the big takeaway of this mass shooting theme? That you should violently confront active shooters, but you should do it unarmed because killing is dishonorable? This one comes up for like 2 pages near the very end and wins points for being the most egregiously hypocritical of the themes. The protagonist has a brief monologue at the end listing the names of the victims and the villains, exhorting the reader to remember them instead of the killers. This is the very first time most of the victims have even been mentioned by name, and in some cases the very first time they were depicted at all. They were killed off-page, and without this list of names, they would have been purely reduced to an implication of gunshots heard in the distance. Up until this page and a half at the very end, this book has been doubling, tripling, and quadrupling down on the idea that the perpetrators are more important than the victims. Both of the perpetrators are twist villains who get multi-chapter side quests dedicated to fleshing them out, while the vast majority of the victims are never mentioned by name prior to that list at the end, and even the ones who did show up on page prior to their deaths were only there for a fraction of a chapter. The guy killed in the sniper attack at the beginning is on that list, and he wasn't even depicted particularly sympathetically. I don't know slasher flicks super well, but I know the victims get way more fleshed out in those. Like, there's specific stock archetypes for slasher victims, while the stock archetype for the slasher themselves is a looming mute predator, lumbering towards the victims with a glacial inevitability, supplemented by the ability to teleport when no one's looking. A regular slasher story would be a great vehicle for this kind of message, where the attacker is reduced to a human-shaped, small-scale natural disaster, while the victims, stereotypical though they may be, get individual personalities and hopes and dreams, even if those hopes and dreams are usually no more complex or noble than getting it on with one of the others. And the fact that there's a bunch of stereotypes and stock personalities to work from means there's really no excuse not to do that if you want a "the victims are more important than the killer" theme. Sure, relying on stereotype is not good writing, but the fact that a quick and lazy option that would have nevertheless carried this theme does exist means it's only more damning that this book pops this theme out of nowhere near the end and tries to pretend it's been there the whole time. There's a line a few scenes before the climax about how, just this once, nobody has to die. About how they're subverting the usual thing where the main cast gets winnowed down by the killer one by one until either everyone is dead or there's a single survivor, the final girl. Apparently this book has forgotten the beginning of the book where a member of the titular support group is killed off-page. Specifically the black one. They even draw attention to how the girl who killed Jason is actually black, but they cast a white actor for her in the film adaptation. Because they made film adaptations of these attacks, so the slashers are both real murderers and also a staple of 80s cinema, a bit of world building that accomplishes exactly nothing. They even talk about sequels and reboots, and sometimes it means a literal sequel or reboot in a film franchise that's dragging one of the final girl's trauma back into the public eye, but sometimes it's a slang term referring to actual repeat attacks, which is especially weird when it comes up for the girl who killed Michael Myers. They talk about how her sequel came within hours of the first incident. This is, I assume, how the first 2 Halloween movies work, with the second film saying, "Just kidding, he's still alive," and then continuing from there. But from an in-universe perspective, it makes absolutely no sense to treat it like this. Slashers don't kill their victims in a single 15-minute blitz, even I know that. The attacks are always spaced out throughout the night, so without the knowledge of when the credits roll in the first film, this should look like it's a single continuous incident. Anyway, the point is that this book gets a negative time speedrun record for the Black Guy Dies First Percent category. I know these are famous last words, but I think that category is finished, guys. And then forgets about the dead black woman so completely that it later says everyone is going to live, and then a few chapters later it's talking about how everyone should remember the names of all the people who totally died, none of whom received more than the barest modicum of attention or sympathy from the narrative until they appeared in that list. The garbled themes of this book suggest in a couple of places this is probably a Discovery written first draft, published with little to no editing, but nowhere is that impression stronger than here, where the book talks about how nobody has to die after people have already died, and then slingshots back to talking about how you should remember the names of the victims after having made no effort to tell the stories of any of the victims. Early on, when the book is setting up backstory, it's established that the woman who killed Jason girl-bossed her way into owning the rights to all the movies made about the event, because the slasher attacks are both a thing that happened in real life and also actual movies. Reboots of the franchises cause media frenzies that send final girls into hiding, which, I guess the woman who killed Jason can't stop that? They don't go super deep into the legal details, so it's possible that she gets the lion's share of the profits, but doesn't get to decide which movies can or can't be produced, and doesn't get so much of the money that the studios won't still make a lot of it if they make films against her wishes. Or maybe she only owns some of the franchises but not others. The book doesn't keep this theme long enough to find out. There's vague hints here that the book is setting up some kind of commentary on slasher movies themselves, and it's fine to be vague like that early on, but then the book loses interest and never develops that theme. The narrative talks about slasher superfans who have cultist devotions to the slashers, and they are occasionally even relevant to the plot, but so briefly that it's hard to say if this is supposed to be a commentary on some segment of slasher fandom, or if it's supposed to be part of one of the book's other briefly entertained themes. Here's a sudden tangent. Bear with me. The general vibe reminds me of when Hotline Miami came out, and a bunch of fucking morons wouldn't shut up about how the game is a commentary on how the audience are degenerate sociopaths who love hurting people. The "do you like hurting people" question that this whole commentary was built on comes from a character who gives you a bullet-pointed list of 4 questions to ponder, and the entire gaming media heard the first one and then their brains went numb. Hotline Miami would be interminably boring if it were just a bunch of helpless bystanders to perform gory execution moves on. The guys you kill in Hotline Miami are also trying to kill you, and they're pretty fucking good at it. It's hard. There is significant resistance. If all you want is the part where you kill a guy, hatred advertised itself as being that kind of game, and nobody gives a shit about hatred as an actual game. The devs might have thought that trailer was made in service of the game, but it's the other way around. Hatred is a YouTube shitpost with a video game adaptation. The answer to the question of do you like hurting other people is no. You would not be playing this video game if the only thing it let you do is hurt other people. So, maybe you're really engaged with the plot. The narrative compels you to push through all the gore and horror to save the city or whatever. Yeah, okay, Hotshot. Question number 2, who's leaving messages on your phone? You don't even know. You don't know if you're saving the city or just fighting for drug money or what, and you never cared. Question 3 asks where you are right now. You don't know that either. Question 4 asks why you're even having this conversation, and that's not clear. Where are you? Why are you risking your life fighting the Russian mafia? These guys are fucking dangerous, and you're positive you've had your skull smashed in at least once or twice, and while hurting other people is obviously not a problem for you, it's not particularly the goal either, so what the fuck, man? And every time you're done, you go for pizza or a video rental or whatever, and it's always the same guy working the counter. Like, how many jobs does he have, and why is he always the one at the register when you walk in, no matter where it is you walk in, and what happened to his fucking eyes? What's going on? You're on a drug trip. It's Miami in the 80s, and you're high on some combination of LSD and cocaine. Plus, there's a whole thing about piecing your identity back together from a coma, but this Hotline Miami tangent has gone on long enough. There was a sufficient critical mass of pretentious idiots on the internet who decided Hotline Miami was criticizing its audience because playing violent video games is basically the same thing as committing actual murders, and probably only the first question from the questions cutscene matters, and the other 3 were just there because the scriptwriter was paid by the word or some shit. And for the 20 pages that Final Girl support group is about slasher movie fans, I kind of get the vibe that it's the pretentious idiot end of that conversation. Like, it kind of starts to say, isn't watching slasher movies kind of like watching a snuff film? And the answer is just like, no, it's not. Stop trying to play like you've got an anime superpowered evil side because you spent a lifetime total of 20 hours watching slasher flicks in college. You know what is kind of like watching a snuff film? Torture porn. The film genre that took over horror after slashers died out. In torture porn, there is no tension of dread and hope, the possibility of death and survival both ever present. Instead, the victims are helpless. Plots usually revolve around futile attempts to escape that reinforce this helplessness. Torture porn advertises itself as, they're trapped and helpless and terrible things will happen to them. Whereas a slasher advertises itself as, a deadly monster is after them, it has killed before and will kill again. There is a horror subgenre whose audiences deserve criticism for being voyeuristically obsessed with human suffering, and it's not the slasher genre. This is another micro-theme maimed by how quickly the book moves on from it. The way the slasher attacks are both real-world events and also movie franchises is some bizarre world-building that contributes basically nothing to the plot, so when I try to figure out what the book is even trying to say with this shit, I veer off into Hotline Miami for 5 paragraphs instead. If this book is trying to say anything about slasher fans, then I'm pretty confident I've identified what it is saying and why it's dumb, but I'm not at all confident it was actually trying to say anything about slasher fans. This book really wants you to know that it's saying something, but it's a lot more coy about what it is saying. This one is mostly notable because of how incredibly brief it is. There are 2 villains. Stephanie is the newest final girl in decades, and Sky is an adult man who wants to do a spree shooting. Stephanie is secretly on Sky's side for unclear reasons. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if it was mainly just because the twist of her betrayal was shocking, and the motives for it were tacked on out of obligation. Anyway, there's a conversation soon after this sudden betrayal about how Stephanie was groomed by Sky, even though all of their email correspondence up to that point show her being an enthusiastic participant. Sky also still lives with his mother and is described as having peach fuzz, which, like, biologically speaking, 26-year-old men basically never have peach fuzz. It's almost impossible. It feels a lot like Sky was clumsily aged up by 10 years with some fine replace edits so that the book could be about how groomers are evil for all of 3 paragraphs. There is a character in this book who explicitly groomed the protagonist when she was 16 in the immediate aftermath of her slasher attack, and that character goes on to be a sleazy but entirely sincere ally of the protagonist. Like, he's only doing it because he expects to get a book deal out of it, but he's still the only man and the only person not in the titular support group who is sincerely on the protagonist's side. He's initially presented as a villain, but then it turns out it was just a scheme to uncover a throwaway assassin affiliated with the villains, who briefly have the support of numerous devoted cultists who are forgotten about in the climax when the two villains are acting entirely without backup. So on the one hand, the groomer participates in the psychological torment of the protagonist to make the assassin feel comfortable making his move, but on the other hand, he then bails her out of that situation, which is more support than any of the protagonist's female allies ever give her up until the climax, when one of them turns out to have dream magic powers that she had all along but chose not to use. This book sure has something to say about groomers, but it isn't even being super clear on whether they're outright villains or just kinda slimy in a way that is ultimately more inconvenient than threatening. The first one is correct, for the record, but the book is waffling on the subject. A side villain for one of the side quests the book meanders through between its opening and climax is a final girl who became enamored with the slashers and has this whole mystical belief in the connection between slashers and final girls. Now, this side villain is a victim who's sympathetic to her attacker, and you can slot that into a couple of the other themes, but she also runs a slasher museum, and she doesn't just express empathy for slashers, she lives with one of them, who serves as her personal goon. She's not just sympathetic to slashers, she is part of the slasher fandom. She doesn't just forgive them, she is pro-slasher. So is this part of the book supposed to be about true crime fans who thirst after the serial killers? The thing with the smaller of these micro-themes is that it can be hard to tell what's coincidence and what's intentional, since the shortest themes get dropped so quickly after being brought up that, maybe this is just a traitor final girl and it's not really supposed to be saying anything. So, really, the main problem here is that the book spends such little time on this theme that I can barely tell if it is a theme. But also, if this is supposed to be a commentary on true crime fans, it's a stupid one. Sure, if you are a nationally famous serial killer whose crimes are breathlessly retold to an audience of millions, primarily female, then one or two of those millions will be disturbed enough to mail you her panties. But that's not because it's common. It's because once an audience reaches a certain size, very rare things become an inevitability. And the super weird thing is that this very performatively feminist book takes this very misogynistic view of true crime fans. Like, the idea that the average woman is dazzled by depraved murderers and can't wait to spread her legs for those who commit senseless violence is a foundational belief of the misogynistic right. It's an accusation that women can't be functional adult members of society, one of their primary justifications for why women's rights need to be curtailed. It's the nice guys finish last complaint seen through to its logical extreme, that most women are attracted to antisocial men, the more antisocial the better, and that without society imposing some kind of restriction, women compete to be harem members for cannibal rapists who talk in the theater, and sexual access trickles down from there through a hierarchy of thuggishness and violence. And as cynical as I am about human weakness, my hot take is still that things aren't that bad. I guess this is the only part of the book that James Somerton read because it fits in pretty snug with the comments from serial killer worshipping straight women that he made up to complain about. I say it's the only part he read because my second major takeaway is that James Somerton didn't read this fucking book. James Somerton invented women to be mad at in the comments on his Yuri on Ice video. I say his, it was stolen content, that's common knowledge, just mentally add an asterisk every time I talk about his videos. Cool? Cool. He invented women to be mad at on his Yuri on Ice video. He claimed that Dahmer fangirls shipping him with his own murder victims were a dominant part of the fan base. He claimed that straight women watching Red, White, and Royal Blue were outraged at its fairly explicit depictions of gay sex, and it turned out to be one bisexual woman who was not outraged, she just didn't know how missionary worked for gay guys. I can't find any record of James' patron-exclusive podcast since he nuked everything, but he did a reading of his autobiography, which is a weirdly self-indulgent turn for a mid-sized video essayist. Wish I'd pay more attention to that red flag. But anyway, he alleges he was falsely accused of sexual assault by a girl from a bad home in middle school, and if he's telling the truth, it's clear he never got over it, and if he's lying, then it says a lot about his opinion of women that he decided to fabricate that. He is not, in short, the kind of guy you would expect to be super thrilled about a book with dialogue like this. Who's in your house? It's just Sky and Pax, she says. Men, I say. It's not like this is setting up a character arc of the protagonist being overly paranoid. Sky is, in fact, the main villain, and even 8-year-old Pax tries to impulsively stab the protagonist with a pencil. Her paranoia regarding both of them is completely vindicated. Or, remember this line? Some boys with instrument cases sit at the back, heads bowed, engrossed in something on one of their phones. Men don't have to pay attention the way we do. Men die because they make mistakes. Women, we die because we're female. You know who actually does suffer from high rates of stranger violence? Gay and bisexual men. I don't know if there's ever been any gay boys in a slasher flick, and my premise here is that I'm not going to find out, I'm reading cold, but come on, blood-soaked horror film from the 80s? If there's ever been a gay kid in one of them, I'm positive he died before Act 3. This is a book that relentlessly pushes the idea that men's trauma doesn't exist, that men get to live in a bubble of safety alongside an invisible parallel universe of women who are in constant danger. It really clearly wants to draw parallels to sexual assault in that way, but then repeatedly shoots itself in the foot because it is about slasher flicks, and slasher flicks are totally happy to plow through men and boys. Their deaths aren't noticed, don't count, don't matter. The book is also obsessed with sexual violence against men. Dicks get kicked, tased, kicked again. Anytime the book worries a scene is getting too boring, it switches to an episode of Ow My Balls. I don't know if this is because Grady Hendrick has a ball-busting fetish, or if he's just osmosed the prefixation with kicking balls from the women's self-defense LARP community. You know, those people who sell pepper spray as a fashion accessory, and fantasy self-defense courses focused on humiliating a male assailant using techniques that don't work on anyone who's fighting back. Now, James Somerton doesn't have the keenest of media analysis skills. If he did, he would have done his own work ever. But when he did add one or two original sentences to someone else's work, it was to shit-talk women. His autobiography, truthfully or not, claims he was the victim of a plainly false sexual assault allegation at a young age. And this guy's favorite novel of 2021 is the novel that, to whatever limited extent it has a theme at all, it's that all men are predators and only women's pain matters. A book that grounds itself vaguely at the crossroads between a genre that kills both men and women indiscriminately and a real-world crime that overwhelmingly targets men, and especially gay and bisexual men, and then it says no, none of those murders count, only women are killed by strangers. Matthew Shepard just moved to a farm upstate with a hammock made of dreams, and James is like 10 out of 10, book of the year. James Somerton didn't read this fucking book. I never watched slasher movies. I've seen bits and pieces out of context on YouTube, but I avoid scary movies. I like that my fight-or-flight reflex is actually a fight-or-flight reflex, and do not love the idea of training a freeze reaction into myself. But I love the idea of the final girl. Learning about the concept several years ago was the first and only time I really considered watching slasher movies. A half dozen ordinary people find themselves stalked by a supernatural horror, sometimes a very explicit revenant or monster, other times just a serial killer so deranged that he may as well be a force of elemental evil. The slasher hunts them down and exacts a disproportionate retribution for crimes real or perceived, and these ordinary people, just teenagers at that, don't have the skills or resources to fight back. But the final girl learns quickly. Despite the terror and injury inflicted on her, she bounces back, turns the tables, slashes the slasher. I never watched Nightmare on Elm Street, but I saw the pitch meeting video about it, and the description of the climax, the final girl checking out a book on booby traps and guerrilla warfare from her local library, like you do, sounded awesome enough that I watched the scene out of context on YouTube, and my reaction was, yes, this scene is why this genre deserves to exist. The audience doesn't seem to agree, though. Slashers are one of those genres killed by a satire that nailed the tropes to the wall so thoroughly that no one dared make another. Blazing Saddles killed the Western, Tropic Thunder killed the Vietnam War movie, and Scream killed the slasher in 1996. Wikipedia tells me a few franchises staggered on through the rest of the 90s. Scream itself lasted until 2000. But the real successor to the slasher movie was the torture porn, debuting with 2004's Saw, and then continuing with franchises like Hostel and Human Centipede. Even in Saw, the only torture porn franchise that ever came close to being about something, there is never a point where the table is turned on the slasher, where a victim is able to rise up and strike back. Those who escape do so by playing Jigsaw's game and crawling meekly away, not by turning it on him. The one time any violence is done to him, it's framed as evidence of the attacker's guilt and unworthiness. Jigsaw isn't meant as a force of evil, but a figure of judgment, and he is not meant to be overcome, but to inspire awe. He doesn't, but he's supposed to. Hostel doesn't even have that thin veneer of philosophy. Hitchhikers are abducted in a scary foreign country, and then terrible things happen to them for 90 minutes, for no better reason except that this foreign country has low state capacity. The porn label is apt because the films are so dull and repetitive that I get bored just hearing them summarized, and yet their target audience never gets sick of them. Films pumped out one after another, barely any variety. Nobody wants avant-garde porn. You want another video of your favorite actress doing your favorite kink with only the minutest of differences so that it is technically a different scene. Everything but the pain and terror has been stripped away. There's no hunt. There's no confrontation. There's no final girl. Silent Night, Deadly Night is a slasher film from the perspective of the slasher, someone raised in an abusive orphanage after his parents were murdered by a criminal in a Santa outfit. He grows up, there's some contrived traumatic trigger, and he goes on a rampage in a Santa outfit of his own. One of his incidental kills is a pair of teenagers who've been having underage sex with each other. The The girl is impaled on a set of antlers mounted on the wall. The killer asks the girl's little sister, a young child, if she'd been naughty or nice this year, and when the child says she's been nice, the killer gives her his box cutter as a gift. Thus spake Wikipedia. Not only have I not watched any slasher movies, nobody has ever watched fucking Silent Night, Deadly Night. It's completely unremembered amongst the slasher genre, and the only reason we are talking about it is because that whole impaled on antlers thing ties it unambiguously to the protagonist of the Final Girl support group. Grady Hendrix edits all the stories in bits and pieces, like rewriting the original slasher of Friday the 13th to be a man instead of a woman, because of course he did. And it's not just because he's skipping straight to Jason. The slasher has the same motivation as Jason's mother. His rewrites to Silent Night, Deadly Night are much more extensive, though. The protagonist of the book, being the one impaled on the antlers, is promoted to the primary target of the rampage, rather than an incidental victim. Her boyfriend, and her family members are the entirety of the victims targeted by the slasher, who is not an orphan traumatized by his parents' death in an abusive orphanage, but an escaped mental patient she'd been pen pals with, writing letters to him in which she'd expressed some vitriol about her controlling father. All the kills happen within the same room, the room where the slasher finds the protagonist and impales her. Her boyfriend tries to defend her there, fails, and dies. Her little sister hears the noise and comes to investigate, and rather than being given a macabre Christmas gift and then left to find her sister's corpse, the child is also brutally murdered. Eventually, the protagonist's parents come home and investigate the noise downstairs, where they too are killed. The protagonist plays dead while clinging to life until, the next day, the police arrive, kill the slasher, and rescue her. All the kills take place within a 15-foot radius, and the emphasis is not on the victims being pursued and cornered, but in how painful, terrifying, and prolonged their demise is. The protagonist survives not because she slashes the slasher, nor because she escapes his grasp, nor because she summoned help, but because she sits there, suffering in silence, watching, until help arrives purely because someone's noticed that Dad didn't show up for work that day. There's no hunt, no confrontation, no final girl. Rewriting a slasher film effectively from scratch, tossing out the structure of the plot, the origin of the slasher, the entire subgenre of horror film, what Grady Hendrix preserves is that a topless 16-year-old girl got impaled on a set of antlers. Apparently his only complaint with that part is that it was over too quickly. The story of the final girl is the story of an ordinary young woman who is hunted by an implacable predator, a predator whose willingness and ability to kill is demonstrated repeatedly. It's no fluke, it's not just a sucker punch. This creature is a killer, and he has the unprepared teens hideously outmatched. And yet, the final girl wins anyway. She escapes by the skin of her teeth. She summons help to overwhelm the killer. Sometimes she wins in the most unambiguous way. She kills the slasher. She is not permitted to escape. She is not found worthy. The slasher tries to kill her and fails. The Final Girl support group takes the most straightforward of the Final Girl's victory, the slashing of the slasher, and makes that a prerequisite to be a Final Girl. The protagonist's Final Girl credentials are questioned because she alone of the support group did not do that. As confused as the end message is by Grady Hendrix's incapability to imagine an actually non-violent end to the story, the nominal theme at the book's climax is that slashing the slasher is bad, actually. The vilification of the Final Girl, who confronts and kills her attacker, in favor of the torture porn survivor, who merely endures until a man comes to rescue her. This isn't the most prominent of the 30-theme pile-up this story is buried under. It's not even the one it ends on. It ends with Stephanie forced to attend the Final Girl support group against her will as a condition of her sentence, while the protagonist resolves in narration to gaslight Stephanie for as many years as it takes to convince her that she was never anything more than Sky's pawn, despite a vacuum of evidence, and indeed a fair amount of evidence that she was the primary motivating force behind the plan, egging on the more cautious and slow-moving Sky. But this theme, the lionization of the torture porn survivor over the Final Girl, is the most damning for the way it criticizes the slasher genre for empowering women too much. For all that it strokes the ego of the presumed female audience, insists that all men are beneath them, it ultimately suggests an attitude of near-total surrender. That the purpose of the titular therapy group is to convince a teenage girl, held from the group by force, of her helplessness before a man's power. That effective resistance is somehow inherently unbecoming of a woman, and that literal magic will step in to save you if you instead limit yourself purely to distraction and pleading, the arsenal of a child. That the most pure of the survivors is the one who didn't kill her attacker, who merely endured until rescued by a man, the same man who groomed her and yet was framed by the narrative as the best of a bad lot, not a good man, but noticeably closer than anyone else with a speaking role, one who would go on to save her again in her darkest moment. That the most loathsome thing is that a woman might fight back against her attacker and win.